Hey guys, tonight we are going to discuss why the gods were not born like us, how prophecy, fate, and power shaped every divine birth. So before we begin our journey, take a moment to like the video, but subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy my video. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over old stories about beginnings. Not the beginning of the world, which is vast and hard to hold in the mind, but the smaller beginnings. The moment a single god first draws breath, or doesn't breathe at all, and simply is. Tonight is for those moments. For the cave on Crete where a stone was swallowed in place of a sun. For a mountain crossing where a woman in labor was refused shelter by every soil that remembered a jealous goddess. For a skull that split open, and for a thigh that closed around a second, secret pregnancy. These are not human births. They were never meant to be. And the differences between what happens in a birthing bed and what happens on Olympus tell us almost everything about what the Greeks and Romans believed power actually was. A human birth begins in uncertainty. A mother does not know, when the pains start, whether the child will be a son or a daughter, whether it will thrive or fade, whether it will grow to bury her or be buried by her. This not knowing is the ordinary shape of mortal life. But a god is born already known. Before Zeus ever drew breath, it was known that he would end the reign of his father. Before Oedipus was born, though he was mortal, his story shares this same architecture. It was known what he would do to the man who fathered him. Prophecy runs ahead of the god, the way a shadow runs ahead of a man walking into the sun. It arrives first. It shapes the room before the child ever enters it. This is the first way a divine birth breaks from a human one. A human child is a question. A divine child is an answer that has already been given, and the whole labor of the story is simply the world catching up to what the prophecy already said. Consider Cronus, who did not wait to see what kind of ruler his children might become. He had heard, from his own mother the earth, from Gaia herself, that one of his sons would depose him exactly as he had deposed his own father, Uranus. So when his wife Rhea bore him children, one after another, he did not raise them. He swallowed them. Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, each one taken into his body, the moment it left hers, sealed away in the dark of him like coins dropped into a well. This was not born of madness, it was born of information. Cronus knew the shape of the future, or believed he did, and he acted on that knowledge the way a man might bar a door because he has heard footsteps on the road. A human father does not swallow his children, but a father who has been told, with total certainty, that one of them will end him. What does he become once he believes that? The myth asks this question through violence because violence is the clearest language for what fear does to power. Rhea grew tired of grief. When she was pregnant with her sixth child, she went to Gaia and to Uranus, to the oldest powers of earth and sky, and asked them to hide her away. They sent her to Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida or Mount Dicte, depending on which storyteller you follow, and there, in secret, away from her husband's hunger, she gave birth to Zeus. And in place of the child, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Cronus, who swallowed it without ever looking closely enough to notice the difference. Imagine that stone for a moment, wound in soft cloth the way any newborn would be wound, warm from Rhea's hands, indistinguishable at a glance from a living child. There is something almost tender in the deception and something monstrous in what it says about Cronus, that he had swallowed 5 children already without truly seeing any of them, so that a stone could pass for the 6th. Fear had made him careless in the one way that should have made him most careful. This is the shape prophecy so often takes in these stories. It does not simply predict the future. It corrodes the present. It makes a father incapable of recognizing his own son because he has stopped looking at children and started looking only for the threat he has been told is coming. Zeus was raised in secret on Crete, hidden in the cave, fed on the milk of the goat Amalthea, guarded by young warriors called the Curetes, who clashed their spears against their shields to drown out the sound of an infant's crying, so that Cronus would not hear it from wherever he sat on his throne of swallowed children. Even the god who would become the sky itself needed, as an infant, to be kept quiet and kept hidden. Even he began in a cave, small and fragile, dependent on noise and shields and a goat's milk to survive long enough to become what the prophecy had already said he would become. He did become it. Grown, Zeus returned and forced his father to disgorge his siblings, the stone coming up first, then Hestia, then the rest, each one emerging fully formed, an adult, the moment they left their father's body a second time, having aged inside him in the dark, the way wine ages inside a cask. This is the second break from human birth. A human is born small and grows slowly, across years, into whatever they will become. A god can be born twice and emerge from the second birth exactly as complete as if no time had passed at all. Time does not work on divine bodies the way it works on ours. It is almost decorative for them. Present in the story because the story needs it, but never truly binding. Nowhere is that more visible than in the birth of Athena. Zeus, warned this time by a different prophecy, that his first wife, Metis, would bear him a son who would overthrow him just as he had overthrown his own father, did not wait for the birth at all. He swallowed Metis whole while she was already pregnant, absorbing her into himself the way his father had once tried to absorb the threat of his children by swallowing them after birth rather than before. Zeus went one step further back. He removed the possibility of birth altogether, or so he believed, taking the mother into his own body before the child could ever separate from her. But Metis was inside him now, and so, in time, was the daughter she carried. Zeus began to suffer a terrible headache, a pain splitting through his skull that no god could ease, until finally Hephaestus, or in some versions Prometheus, took an axe to his father's head and split it open. And out stepped Athena, fully grown, fully armoured, helmet already on her head, spear already in her hand, born not from a womb but from the skull of a god who had tried to prevent her existence and had instead simply relocated it. She did not cry. She did not need to be fed or hidden or guarded by clashing spears. She arrived a warrior, wisdom already settled into her like something that had always been there, because it had. She had grown inside her father's mind, quite literally, and emerged already knowing what a human child spends a lifetime learning. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A goddess of wisdom, born from the head rather than the body, as though the story itself is telling you where to look for her. Not in the heart, not in the womb, but in thought, in the skull, in the place where reasoning lives. The Greeks were not being arbitrary when they chose this birth. They were showing you, through the architecture of a myth, what kind of power Athena represented before they ever needed to say it in words. Dionysus was born stranger still, and twice. His mother, Semele, a mortal woman, was tricked by a jealous Hera into asking her lover Zeus to reveal himself in his true divine form. Zeus had promised to grant her any wish, and once the promise was made, he could not take it back, even knowing what it would cost her. He appeared before her as he truly was, lightning and thunder, and a brightness no mortal body could hold. And Semele burned in the sight of him, consumed by the very presence of the god who had loved her. But her son survived. Zeus took the unborn child from her body and stitched it into his own thigh, carrying the pregnancy to its term himself, so that when Dionysus was finally born, he emerged not from a mother at all, but from his father's flesh, twice born, once from a woman who could not survive the sight of divinity, and once from a god who could hold anything, even a womb, inside himself without harm. A human mother can die in childbirth. It is one of the oldest griefs there is. But a divine birth simply relocates around that grief. The child does not die with the mother. The story finds another vessel, another body, another way through, because the birth was never truly optional. It was owed to the future, the moment the prophecy or the desire or the divine will decided it would happen. Fate does not ask a womb's permission. Aphrodite's birth breaks from human birth in the opposite direction, not by refusing death, but by refusing a mother altogether. When Cronus overthrew his own father, Uranus, he did it with a sickle, castrating him and casting the severed flesh into the sea. Where it touched the water, foam gathered, pale and churning, and from that foam, fully grown, rose Aphrodite, walking out of the sea onto the shore of Cyprus as though she had simply always been walking there and the water had only now caught up to reveal her. No womb, no labour, no mother at all, human or divine, only violence, transformed by seawater into beauty, love itself born from the wreckage of one god's ruin of another. It is difficult to imagine a birth story more unlike a human one. There is no family in it. There is only aftermath. Hermes' birth is almost gentle by comparison, though no less strange in its speed. Born to Zeus and the nymph Maia in a cave on Mount Cyllene, he did not lie in his cradle the way a human infant would. By midday of the same morning he was born, he had already climbed free of his blankets and gone wandering, and by evening he had stolen a herd of cattle belonging to his own half-brother Apollo, driving them backwards so their tracks would confuse anyone who followed. A single day held his entire infancy. What takes a human child years? Learning to walk, to reason, to deceive, to plan. Hermes accomplished before nightfall on the day he was born, because a god does not need years. The story simply will not slow down for him the way it must slow down for us. Even Apollo and Artemis, twins born to the Titaness Leto, carry fate directly into the circumstances of their arrival. Hera, furious at Zeus's infidelity yet again, decreed that no land touched by the sun could offer Leto a place to give birth. Leto wandered, refused by island after island, country after country, each one afraid of Hera's wrath, until she came to Delos, a floating island that belonged to no fixed place under the sun, and so was bound by no such decree. There, holding onto a palm tree for 9 days and 9 nights of labour, she finally bore her children. Even the ground a god is born on has to be found through loophole and negotiation, through a technicality in the wording of a curse, because that is what fate demands when the world itself has been ordered to refuse you. What all of these births share, whether by stone or by skull, by thigh or by sea foam, by cave or by floating island, is this: none of them are private. A human birth, however witnessed, however attended, belongs in some essential way to the mother and the child alone. A divine birth belongs to the world. It is announced before it happens, resisted before it happens, engineered around before it happens, because everyone who might be affected by the child already knows, in some sense, what that child will become. Prophecy does not describe the future so much as it drags the future backward into the moment of birth itself, so that the infant is never truly new. It arrives already carrying what it will do decades or centuries hence, the way a stone thrown into still water carries, in its very first ripple, the shape of every ring that will follow. That is the real difference, in the end. Not the fire, not the sea foam, not the thigh or the skull. It is that a human child is a mystery being slowly solved, 1 year at a time, while a god is a truth being slowly revealed, 1 myth at a time. The ending already fixed, the beginning only now catching up to meet it. Perseus, the son of Zeus, was abandoned by his grandfather, King Acrisius, due to a dark prophecy. He and his mother, Danae, were saved by a fisherman named Dictys on the island of Seriphos. However, Dictys' brother, King Polydectes, desired to marry Danae and devised a plan to rid himself of Perseus by sending him on an impossible quest to behead the Gorgon Medusa. With the help of the gods, Perseus completed this daunting task and rescued a princess along the way. Discover the epic tale of the hero Perseus. In Greek mythology, the birth of a hero often begins with Zeus's lust. Zeus frequently disguises himself as a mortal or an animal to seduce his romantic partners. In the story of Perseus, Zeus takes on one of his most unusual disguises to pursue Perseus's mother, Princess Danae. Perseus's grandparents, King Acrisius of Argos and Queen Eurydice, had only one daughter, Danae. However, Acrisius longed for a son to inherit his kingdom and consulted the Oracle of Delphi about the possibility of having a male heir. The oracle informed Acrisius that he would never have the son he desired. Instead, she revealed that Danae would eventually have a son, whom the oracle warned was destined to kill Acrisius. Acrisius's thoughts shifted from securing an heir to self-preservation, fearing the threat of his unborn grandson. At this time, Danae was not pregnant, but motivated by familial love and the fear of blood guilt, Acrisius could not harm her. In ancient Greek society, certain crimes, especially murdering a family member or blood guilt, were considered so heinous that they could taint one's soul and invoke the wrath of the vengeful Erinyes, who would drive the perpetrator to madness. To avoid this fate, Acrisius constructed a bronze tower to safeguard himself and isolate Danae from potential suitors. Men were forbidden to enter the tower, and Danae was forbidden to leave, but Acrisius provided her with every comfort he could offer. However, news of the beautiful princess trapped at the top of the tower quickly spread and even reached the gods on Olympus. When Zeus learned of Danae's predicament, he became infatuated with her. Danae was known as one of the most beautiful women in the realm, and the idea of making love to a woman trapped in an impenetrable tower excited him just as much as her beauty did. Zeus relished a challenge. His usual transformation tricks would not be effective, so he devised a brilliant and unconventional plan to reach the imprisoned princess. One night, Zeus descended from Olympus to the city of Argos, transforming himself into a shower of gold that fell upon a bronze tower. In some versions of the story, this golden shower is described as gold dust, while in others, it is depicted as golden rain that poured through the roof of the tower and landed in the lap of Danae. Danae realized that this unusual golden shower was an act of seduction from Zeus and understood that she had become pregnant. She was able to hide her pregnancy from her father until after she gave birth, at which point Acrisius heard the cries of a baby coming from the tower. Acrisius found himself in a challenging predicament. He believed Danae's claim that Zeus was the father, as only a god could have broken into the impenetrable tower. Acrisius hesitated to harm the child, fearing the wrath of the Erinyes and the vengeance of Zeus. Instead, he decided to seal Danae and Perseus in a wooden chest and abandon them at sea. The king reasoned that this action did not constitute harm, as it would leave their fates to chance. If they perished, it was the will of the gods. If they survived, Perseus would be far away, unable to threaten him. Danae and Perseus were set adrift, but Zeus aided them by having Poseidon guide their chest to the island of Seriphos. On the shores of Seriphos, Danae and Perseus were liberated from their wooden prison by a local fisherman named Dictys, the brother of the island's king, Polydectes. Unlike his cruel brother, Dictys was a kind man who took Danae in and helped her raise Perseus. As time passed, Polydectes learned of his brother's beautiful new houseguest. Danae's beauty never faded, and Polydectes made numerous attempts to seduce her, but she always rejected him. Over the years, Perseus grew into an athletic youth, becoming strong enough to defend his mother from Polydectes' unwanted attention. Despite Perseus' efforts, Polydectes remained resolute and devised a plan to rid himself of the annoying youth. He declared his intention to marry Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa. An oracle warned Oenomaus that he would be killed by his son-in-law, prompting him to challenge any suitors to a chariot race. Oenomaus was the best charioteer in the lands, and only those who could defeat him would win Hippodamia's hand. Failure meant beheading. Many contenders tried, but Oenomaus defeated them all, keeping the oracle's prophecy at bay. Polydectes hosted a banquet, asking guests to bring a horse as a wedding gift to help him defeat Oenomaus. Perseus, raised in a poor household, felt ashamed and could not afford a horse. When he asked for an alternative gift, Polydectes demanded the head of Medusa. Unsure of what a Medusa was but eager to regain his honor, Perseus accepted the challenge, not realizing he had fallen into a trap. Slaying the Gorgon Medusa was deemed impossible, and Polydectes was confident Perseus would fail, leaving his mother vulnerable to the king's advances. Perseus quickly realized the difficulty of the quest which he had impulsively accepted. Before he could confront Medusa, he needed to locate her, but no one could tell him where she was. His quest seemed to stall before it had even begun, and without any leads, Perseus prayed to the gods for assistance. Zeus heard his plea and sent his children, Athena and Hermes, to get their half-brother back on track. Athena and Hermes appeared to Perseus and whisked him away from Seriphos to the legendary garden of the Hesperides, nestled on an island at the eastern edge of the world. The Hesperides were the beautiful nymphs of the evening, associated with the western sunsets, responsible for guarding the grove of golden apples that belonged to the goddess Hera. Ladon, the immortal, 100-headed dragon, aided them in this task. Under the vigilant protection of the Hesperides and Ladon, the garden gained a reputation among the Olympians as a secure place to store their most valuable treasures. The Hesperides guided their guests through the orchard of golden apples to the treasures of Olympus. Athena and Hermes presented several gifts to Perseus to help him defeat Medusa. Athena gave Perseus a shield with a polished surface, instructing him to polish it to a mirror finish every day. On behalf of their father, Zeus, she provided Perseus with an unbreakable, adamantine sickle sword called a harp. Hermes gave Perseus winged sandals that allowed him to fly and presented him with Hades' helmet of invisibility on behalf of their uncle in the underworld. Finally, the Hesperides gifted Perseus a magical satchel called the Kybesis to store Medusa's head safely. Perseus was now equipped with some of the most powerful items from Olympus. However, he still did not know where to find Medusa. Athena and Hermes informed Perseus that they could not reveal Medusa's location. The gifts they had given him were already stretching the limits of the divine aid that gods could provide to a mortal. They advised him to seek out a trio of sisters known as the Grey, who held the secrets to locating Medusa. In some versions of the myth, Athena and Hermes instruct Perseus to locate the Grey first. By doing so, he learns the location of the Hesperides, who then tell him where to find the Gorgons and provide him with the magical equipment needed to defeat Medusa. The Grey, also known as the Grey Sisters, were a trio of haggard, grey-haired elderly women who represented the white foam of the sea. While some accounts claim there were only 2 sisters, most sources record 3, naming them Pemphredo, she who guides the way, Enyo the warlike one, and Dano the terrible one, though some versions replace Dano with Persis the destroyer. The Grey are depicted as old, withered crones, and a unique feature of the sisters is that they share a single detachable eye and tooth among them. The Grey were the daughters of the sea deities Ceto and Phorcys and close sisters of the Gorgons. Although the Grey were generally harmless, they held an important secret that they protected dearly: the location of the Gorgons. Perseus used Hermes' sandals to fly to the island of Sisthene in the east, where the Grey lived. When he confronted the Grey sisters to ask for the location of the Gorgons, they refused to answer him. Despite his pleas, the sisters remained silent, passing their shared eye and tooth among themselves to get a better look at their uninvited visitor. Growing impatient, Perseus snatched the Grey's eye and tooth as they passed them to each other. He refused to return them until they revealed the location of the Gorgons. Now blind and toothless, the Grey quickly agreed and told Perseus that the Gorgons lived in a cave not far from where they were. Honoring his promise, Perseus returned the eye and tooth to the Grey before flying to the home of his prey, the Gorgon Medusa. Medusa and her younger sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were the fearsome Gorgons, daughters of the sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. This trio of monstrous, winged women possessed brass talons, boar tusks, and serpents for hair. Their large, bulging eyes held a deadly power, the ability to turn a person to stone with just one glance. While some claim that Medusa possessed only the power to turn people to stone, she was distinct from her sisters in many ways. Medusa was the only mortal in her family and, unlike her sisters, did not start her life as a Gorgon. She was once a beautiful maiden whose beauty captivated Poseidon, making him infatuated with her. In some versions of the myth, Medusa and Poseidon were lovers before the fateful night that changed her life forever. However, in most accounts, Poseidon raped Medusa while she was visiting one of Athena's sacred temples. Engaging in sexual intercourse in the temple of the Virgin Athena, whether consensual or not, was viewed as an unforgivable act of blasphemy. Athena, unable to punish Poseidon, a fellow Olympian, for assaulting Medusa in her temple, directed her anger towards the victim, Medusa. As a result, Athena transformed Medusa into a Gorgon, condemning her to be hunted by men. Some later accounts suggest that Medusa angered Athena by claiming to be more beautiful than her in an attempt to justify her harsh punishment. When Perseus arrived at Medusa's cave, he found a macabre garden of statues, all frozen in various poses of terror and confusion. Perseus waited until nightfall, hoping that Medusa and her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, would be asleep when he launched his attack. He polished Athena's shield to pass the time until it gleamed like a mirror. He knew looking directly at Medusa would turn him to stone, but he could avoid her deadly gaze by watching her reflection in the shield. Gazing at his reflection in the mirror, Perseus practiced swinging his sword, getting accustomed to the inverted motion reflected at him to prepare for his attack. Just after midnight, he donned all the gifts given to him by the gods, except for Hades' helmet, as he could not see his reflection in the shield while invisible. Fully prepared, he descended, flying low to avoid making noise with his footsteps. Perseus quietly entered Medusa's cave, flying backward and using Athena's mirrored shield for guidance. Soon, he spotted Medusa sleeping alone among her family of stone statues, visible through the reflection in the mirror. Perseus carefully approached the slumbering Medusa, keeping his back turned as he drew his father's sword. Gazing at the shield, Perseus swung his blade, severing the neck of the sleeping Medusa with one decisive blow. As the sword sliced through her neck, Medusa opened her eyes and unleashed an ear-piercing scream, her bulging eyes desperately searching to petrify her attacker. In her final moments, Medusa only saw the back of a man's head and her reflection in a shining shield as her head was cut free from her body. Still staring at the shield, Perseus reached out and grabbed Medusa's head, clutching the still writhing snake hair, and plunged it into the magical satchel, safely sealing away Medusa's petrifying eyes. Perseus had little time to celebrate. Medusa's final cries had awakened her sisters, who came charging in looking for her. However, Before they could reach him, Perseus donned Hades' helmet, turning invisible and avoiding the Gorgon's notice. He then flew out of the cave as fast as Hermes' sandals could take him. If Perseus had dared to stay, he would have witnessed something as unusual as his divine conception. From the stump of Medusa's neck, fully formed twin brothers emerged, the white-winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor wielding a golden sword. It turned out that Medusa had been pregnant with Poseidon's twin sons throughout her entire life as a Gorgon. Upon her death, with the help of Perseus' sword, she could finally bring her sons into the world. Later versions of the myth suggest that Perseus and Pegasus would join forces for the rest of the hero's adventure. During his flight back to Seriphos, Perseus passed through Ethiopia, where he observed a frightening scene. A beautiful naked woman chained to a rock as a sea monster approached her, ready to devour her. Ethiopia was ravaged by a destructive sea monster named Cetus at the time. The beast's rampage was triggered by Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia, who claimed she was more beautiful than all 50 Nereids, the daughters of the sea deity Nereus. This remark angered Poseidon, who sent Cetus to wreak havoc as punishment. King Cepheus, Cassiopeia's husband, consulted an oracle on how to appease the sea god. The oracle revealed that the only solution was to sacrifice his daughter, Andromeda, to the monster. To save his kingdom, Cepheus was forced to do the unthinkable. This was the situation Perseus had unknowingly flown into on his journey home. A true hero at heart, Perseus flew down armed with either his adamantine blade or the head of Medusa and defeated the creature before it could reach her. Afterward, Perseus freed Andromeda and returned her to her parents, who expressed their gratitude and asked him to name his reward for saving their daughter. Perseus requested Andromeda's hand in marriage, and they happily agreed. Their wedding was quickly arranged. The wedding festivities were interrupted by Phineus, Andromeda's uncle and Cepheus's brother, who had initially been promised Andromeda's hand in marriage. A fight quickly broke out, and Perseus ordered everyone loyal to him and Andromeda to stand behind him and close their eyes. Once they complied, Perseus took Medusa's head from his satchel, turning Phineus and his entourage into stone. After the wedding, Perseus flew back to Seriphos with Andromeda. During their journey, droplets of Medusa's blood seeped from the satchel, falling to the earth and creating the poisonous snakes of the Sahara. Upon arriving in Seriphos, Perseus quickly discovered that he had been deceived. Polydectes had continued his unwanted advances toward Perseus's mother and was planning to marry her forcibly. Perseus marched into Polydectes' palace, demanding his mother's release, as he had come bearing the king's promised wedding gift. Polydectes assumed that Perseus was merely bluffing, believing no mortal could defeat Medusa. To humor him, the king agreed to look at the gift. When Perseus revealed it, Polydectes and his guards were instantly petrified, their stone faces reflecting shock and confusion. After completing his quest, Perseus returned his divine gifts to the gods and Medusa's head. Athena incorporated Medusa's head into her Aegis shield, making it a powerful weapon. Perseus appointed his adoptive father, Dictys, the new king of Seriphos. Afterward, he chose to return to Argos, the land of his birth and home of his grandfather Acrisius, accompanied by Andromeda and his mother. Acrisius learned about Perseus's return home and decided to flee to maintain the distance that had long existed between them. However, fate is inescapable. Shortly after returning to Argos, Perseus chose to participate in athletic games in Larissa. During the discus competition, Perseus overshot his throw and accidentally hit an elderly man in the audience, who died instantly. It was later revealed that the victim was Acrisius. Although Perseus had never known his grandfather, he was overwhelmed with guilt and refused to take the throne of Argos. Instead, he exchanged the kingdom with his cousin Megapenthes, who granted Perseus the kingdom of Tiryns. Under Perseus's rule, the city of Tiryns thrived, establishing the powerful Perseid dynasty. He and Andromeda had 9 children, who became the ancestors of some of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology, including the Persians, Heracles, Helen of Troy, and the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux. Perseus is one of the few heroes in Greek mythology who lived happily ever after and died peacefully at an old age. He was a rare hero who knew when to stop and, most importantly, when to ask for help. Indeed, there would be no other hero like the divinely gifted Perseus. The goddess Persephone served many roles in Greek mythology. Her relationship with Hades remains one of the most infamous stories in the Greek mythological canon. Specifically, the various versions of how Hades and Persephone came to be a couple. Additionally, as queen of the underworld, she played an essential part in multiple other great stories, from Hercules and Orpheus to Sisyphus and beyond. Persephone is most commonly known today by her Greek name, meaning bringer of death, but she was also known by many other monikers and titles in Greek and Roman mythologies. Initially, she was also called Kore, the maiden, a reference to her determined virgin status and her role as goddess of spring. In Roman mythology, she is known as Proserpina or Proserpina, mistress of the Erinyes, otherwise known as the Three Furies, Alecto, Megara, and Tisiphone. As Demeter's daughter, and because of her close relationship with her mother, Persephone and her mother were known together as the two Demeters and the two goddesses, to represent both the intimate nature of their relationship and their shared agricultural duties. In her role as Queen of the Underworld, she was known by many titles, including the Pure One, the Venerable One, and the Great Goddess. It is likely that she was given these names because she was feared by humans who knew her to be a ruler of the underworld. The greater and nicer name a god or goddess received, the more likely they were to be feared. The names were thought to appease the feared gods and goddesses in some way. The goddess Persephone is known for serving as the goddess of spring, but she also operated in a variety of other important roles in Greek mythology. Like her mother, Demeter, Persephone was an agriculturally based goddess who presided over grains and vegetation, leading her to be known as the goddess of vegetation. However, aside from serving in her own individual role as one of the Olympian gods, she also ruled over the underworld with Hades. In the underworld, Persephone was something of a protectress. Hades, known as Pluto to the Romans, had many dealings with various heroes like Hercules, Odysseus, and Orpheus that traipsed throughout his domain, and usually he was not very understanding once he discovered them. In most cases, these heroes ended up owning their lives and eventual freedom to Persephone, who would intervene and rescue heroes from what would often be grisly fates. Persephone was born to the Greek gods Zeus and Demeter. Demeter was most commonly recognized as the goddess of the harvest, and in that role, she watched over all grains and fertility on earth. She also served as the goddess of agriculture, fertility, the cycle of life, sacred law, and death. She gave birth to her daughter, Persephone, and it was her daughter's story for which she was most well known. Unlike many other Greek gods and goddesses, Demeter was not mentioned very often by Homer, but her legend in relation to Persephone was likely quite ancient. Zeus, unlike his sister and fourth wife, Demeter, is much more widely known. His exploits and various relationships have marked most of Greek mythology in one way or another. Zeus was the chief deity of the Olympian pantheon and served as god of the sky. He was seen as a ruler, protector, and father to both gods and human beings, and was often represented by lightning bolts and eagles. In addition to her parents, Persephone had one full sibling, a minor deity named Iacchus, and a myriad of half-siblings from both her mother and father. A popular myth in ancient Greece was the story of Hades and Persephone, which goes as follows. Hades, the god of the underworld, saw Persephone one day while she was picking flowers in one of her mother's fields. He fell in love with her after Aphrodite, the goddess of love, struck him with a love arrow and swept her away in his chariot to live with him in the underworld. When Demeter heard that Persephone was missing, she searched all over the earth for her until Hermes told her what Hades had done. Demeter continued searching for her beloved daughter but did not find her. She then withdrew from the world to live in a temple she had built in Persephone's honor. Her absence caused a great drought, and famine spread across the world. Consequently, the gods confronted Hades and asked him to release Persephone. Eventually, Zeus sent Hermes to convince Hades to let Persephone go. Hades agreed but offered Persephone pomegranate seeds before allowing her to leave. Unsuspicious, Persephone ate the seeds. Rather than being hospitable, Hades was tricking Persephone. Because she had consumed food from the underworld, she was no longer able to be released. However, a compromise was reached in that she would be allowed to go free for part of the year as long as she returned to Hades at the end of summer. In other Greek myths, Hades forced the pomegranate seeds into Persephone's mouth, but the end result was the same. It was through this tale and Persephone's time in the different realms that the ancient Greeks explained the existence of the seasons and their cyclical nature. In the spring, she would return, bringing life with her and making her mother happy so that the lands prospered. Then, as she left in the fall, everything would turn grey and lifeless again until her return, creating an eternal cycle. In many ways, the relationship between Hades and Persephone mirrors the relationship Zeus had with Hera. Each couple was powerful in its own right and influenced Greek mythology. Zeus and Hades were juxtaposed as lords of the overworld, otherwise known as heaven or Mount Olympus, and the underworld. Each god tricked his wife into marriage, Hades with the pomegranate and Zeus by transforming himself into a little bird to gain Hera's affection after she evaded their arranged marriage for 3 years. But despite their bad methods of seduction, each god loved his wife in his own way. The difference here was how they handled that love. Hera, as the goddess of marriage, wanted a husband who would honor his vows, but Zeus was nothing if not the playboy, constantly seducing anyone he fancied. Meanwhile, Hades was loyal to Persephone and never loved another. Additionally, throughout the Greek myths, Zeus and Hera were constantly fighting with each other while Hades and Persephone were always noted to live happily together. While Hera was famous for acting against her husband's various loves by causing their deaths or punishing them in various inventive ways, Persephone only acted in contradiction to Hades to save the lives of people who had entered the underworld. Additionally, she was able to wield her power not only to save others but to support her husband in the process. Not many other gods or goddesses were capable of such feats. Though a maiden goddess, zealously defended by her mother for a long time, Persephone did eventually have 2 children, a daughter named Melino and a son called Zagreus. Melione, also called Melena, was the goddess of ghosts and spirits. She was said to bring nightmares to whomever she visited. Most ancient sources stated that she was conceived by Persephone and Hades. However, some stories claim that she was created after Zeus, disguised as Hades, visited Persephone. Melione, meaning dark-minded, was said to have black limbs on one side of her body and white on the other, a physical representation of her juxtaposed natures of heaven and Hades. Zagreus, or Great Hunter, was the god of Orphic mysteries. His birth was the result of a tryst between the goddess Persephone and Zeus, when the god disguised himself as a serpent and seduced the queen of the underworld. Once he was born, Zeus placed Zagreus on the throne of heaven and gave the child his lightning bolts, unknowing that the Titans would trick and dismember the boy once Hera poisoned their minds against him. Zeus saved the child's heart and made it into a potion that Semele drank, thereby conceiving Dionysos. Because she was the goddess of spring, Persephone was often associated with many spring-themed symbols. Wreaths of flowers, reeds, lilies, and precious gems were all associated with her in various forms. Any form of vegetation, animal, or even scent representing new life was related to Persephone in some way or another because it was only upon her return to Earth that life could go on each year. 2 of her most prominent symbols were pomegranates and the narcissus flower because of their strong relation to the origin story of Hades and Persephone's relationship. However, asphodel, or asphodel, also played a key role in Persephone's symbolism. Asphodel is a type of flower that grows across Europe and the Middle East, though it can be found in other places. It was associated with Persephone because, in Greek mythology, it was the flower of the dead and the underworld. In many depictions, Persephone is shown to wear a garland of asphodels as a sign of life and death. In conclusion, the goddess Persephone was a figure unparalleled in Greek mythology. Her power extended to places that few other gods were ever able to reach, and Hades and Persephone's story lives on as one of the most memorable mythological tales. Achilles is a great hero from ancient Greece, but there is more to this soldier than a pretty face and a mean right hook. As a hero, Achilles symbolized both mankind's excellence and its extreme vulnerability. The Greeks of Eld venerated this man, the bravest, most handsome, toughest of the Achaean forces. However, his sensitivity and pitiful circumstances are what left a lasting impact. After all, at the age of his death, Achilles was a mere 33 years old. He entered the official war at 23, and for a decade knew nothing of anything else. He was impulsive and let his emotions get the best of him. Youthful Achilles represented the best and worst of mankind. His identity was a heavy burden to bear. Above all else, Achilles became the embodiment of what grief and war could drive one to do. The rage directed at forces beyond one's control and the knee-jerk reaction to loss are all too familiar in today's day and age. It is true that while Homer may have given life to the Greek hero known as Achilles, his legendary death in Troy did not mark the end of him. Achilles was a renowned hero in Greek mythology, predominantly during the Trojan War. He had the reputation as the strongest soldier of the Greeks. Few could match his might, and many fell to his blade. In Greek mythology, Achilles was the son of Thetis, a sea nymph, and Peleus, an aged Greek hero that became the king of Phthia. When Achilles was born, Thetis became obsessed with keeping Achilles safe. She went to extreme lengths to ensure that her son was untouchable, regardless of his destined mortality. A young Thetis actually held the affections of Zeus and Poseidon until a pesky little prophecy ruined their romantic relationships for good. Apparently, the child born to Thetis would be greater than his father, so having the literal king of the gods be that guy isn't a good idea. At least, not for Zeus. Once Prometheus spilled the prophetic beans, Zeus saw Thetis as nothing more than a walking red flag. He let Poseidon in on the not-so-secret secret, and both brothers lost feelings fast. So, what else were the gods to do except marry off the pretty nymph to an old, mortal hero? After all, the child Ahem, Achilles, would be the son of an average Joe, meaning he would pose no threat to the gods. That should fix the problem, right? It was at the wedding of Thetis and Peleus that Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, crashed. She tossed in the apple of discord between goddesses Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, which led to the judgment of Paris. When the unsuspecting princeling awarded Aphrodite the golden apple of discord, his fate, and the fate of Troy, was all sealed. Achilles, despite his supernatural fortitude, was not a god or a demigod. He was the son of a sea nymph, who despite being long-lived are not immortal, and a mortal man. Thus, Achilles was not born of divine stock. Achilles' mother, Thetis, was unfortunately very aware of such a fact. Achilles' birth and death both act as evidence of his mortality. After all, in Greek myths, gods do not die. Also, while demigods certainly can die, Achilles' known parentage disqualifies him from being a demigod. Achilles was in the Greek army at the time of the Trojan War, much to the displeasure of his mother, Thetis. He led a contingent of Myrmidons during the 10-year conflict, arriving on the shores of Troy with 50 ships of his own. Each ship carried 50 men, meaning that Achilles alone added 2,500 men to the Greek army. The Myrmidons were soldiers from the Phthiatis region of Thessaly, which is believed to be Achilles' homeland. Today, the capital city is Lamia, though during the time of Achilles, it was Phthia. Achilles was not a suitor of Helen. He had not yet been born during the selection of suitors or was an infant at the time. Such a fact makes him stand out against other characters central to the Trojan War. Since the oath of Tyndareus could not be exacted with Achilles, the hero wasn't required to fight. Or, he wouldn't have been if there wasn't for that prophecy stating that he was vital to the success of the Greek campaign. In all, Achilles was not obligated to obey Agamemnon on account of the oath taken by the suitors of Helen. Most knowledge we have on Achilles' role in mythology is from the epic poem, the Iliad. Achilles is then expanded upon in Aeschylus' fragmented trilogy, the Achilles. Meanwhile, the unfinished Achilleid written by Roman poet Statius in the 1st century CE is meant to chronicle Achilles' life. These sources all explore Achilles as he was in Greek mythology, flaws and all. Achilles is still revered as the greatest warrior of his time despite his early death at Troy. He was infamous for being a thorn in the Greek god's side and a fearsome opponent on the battlefield. His divine armor, unmatchable determination, and merciless ferocity all came to support his legend. Throughout his related myths, Achilles is shown to be impulsive. Although it is clear that he can perform his duty as an Achaean warrior, most of Achilles' most notable feats are those that are emotionally charged. When Achilles was born, his mother was desperate to make her beloved son immortal. Since Thetis had wed a mortal and she was a simple Nereid herself, her son had the same fleeting lifespan as any other human. She lamented the fact, despairing that she would be holding Achilles, a glorious star, in the heavens if her marriage were to an immortal. If such an arrangement had been made, Thetis would not fear the lowly fates or the destinies of earth. In an attempt to grant her son immortality, Thetis travelled to the realm of Hades. Once there, Thetis dipped Achilles into the river Styx, holding him by his ankle. The Stygian waters washed over infant Achilles, making the boy practically untouchable. That is, all except his heel that his mother held him by. In another variation of this myth found in the Argonautica, Thetis anointed Achilles with ambrosia and burned away the mortal parts of him. Peleus, her husband, interrupted her before she could finish, explaining how Achilles had a vulnerability in his heel. Achilles, being a godlike man with a single vulnerability in his heel, emerged from the writings of Statius. When the Trojan War rolls around in the Iliad, Achilles does get wounded in skirmishes, unlike in later literature. When Achilles became old enough, his parents did what any parents in ancient Greece would do if they had high hopes for their kiddo: drop them off for hero training. Chiron, a kindly centaur, was usually the go-to guy for training Greek heroes. He was the son of Cronus and a nymph, Philyra, which made him markedly different from other centaurs local to Thessaly. Luckily, Peleus had a long history with Chiron, who may or may not have been his grandfather, so he knew Achilles was in safe hands on Mount Pelion. It also comforted Thetis, who was glad that her son could now defend himself. When his training was complete, Achilles taught everything he knew to his companion, Patroclus. Tensions began to rise with Troy, and it soon became clear that war was inevitable. As it turns out, Paris was not keen on returning his newfound bride. At the first signs of conflict, Thetis sent Achilles off to the island of Skyros. There, Achilles hid among the daughters of Lycomedes. He went by the name Pyrrha and was flawlessly disguised as a young woman of King Lycomedes' court. During his stay, he fathered a child with a princess of Skyros, Deidamia, Neoptolemus. This plan to protect and keep Achilles away from the front lines probably would have worked, if not for Odysseus. A prophet had claimed that Troy would not and could not be captured without Achilles' help. Alas, when Achilles was a no-show, Odysseus was charged with searching for the great warrior. While there was suspicion that Achilles was in Skyros, Odysseus needed hard proof. So, he dressed as a merchant visiting the court, bringing gowns, jewels, and weapons sus to the court. When the sound of a war horn rang out according to Odysseus' plan, Achilles was the only one to react. Without hesitation, then 15-year-old Achilles grabbed a spear and shield to protect the court that had been harboring him since he was 9 years old. Although he was still under the guise of Pyrrha, the jig was up. Odysseus removed Achilles from King Lycomedes' court and brought him before Agamemnon. In the Iliad, not everything was smooth sailing for the Greeks at the start of the Trojan War. Actually, they weren't sailing at all. Agamemnon had insulted the goddess Artemis, and as revenge, she stilled the winds. In these early stages of the war, the Greek gods and goddesses were still divided amongst themselves. The Trojans were supported by a third of the Olympian gods, including the Greek gods Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and Aphrodite. Meanwhile, the Greeks had the backing of the goddess Hera, Athena, and of course Achilles' mother. Other deities were either uninvolved or routinely playing both sides during the war. Since Artemis was wronged by Agamemnon, the Greek fleet was stuck in the Aulis harbour. A seer was consulted, and she advised that Agamemnon had to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, to appease Artemis. Although disturbed by the request, Agamemnon had no other lead to follow. As long as the ends justify the means, anything was on the table, including sacrificing your child. Suspecting that his daughter and wife wouldn't be down with the sacrifice, Agamemnon lied. He claimed that a wedding would be held for Achilles to marry Iphigenia, thus requiring her presence at the docks. Since Achilles was the most handsome of the Achaeans and was already considered a great warrior, there was no debate. At the hour of the supposed wedding, it became clear that Iphigenia was tricked. The deceit angered Achilles, who was unaware that his name had even been used. He tried to intervene, but despite his best efforts, Iphigenia agreed to be sacrificed anyway. During the fabled Trojan War, Achilles was considered to be the greatest warrior of the Greek forces. His staying in the fight was crucial to the success of the Greeks, as per a prophecy. Though, it was also well known that if Achilles were to participate in the war, he would come to perish in far-off Troy, another prophecy. It was a catch-22. To fight meant that he would die, but if Achilles refused, then his comrades would die. Thetis knew, Achilles knew, and so did every one of the Achaeans. Homer's Iliad begins by calling upon the Muses to tell the tale of Achilles' wrath and its unavoidable consequences. He is, undoubtedly, the main character of the story. The decisions Achilles makes affect everyone else, no matter if they were Achaean or Trojan. In the war, Achilles commanded the Myrmidons. However, he pulls out of the fight after butting heads with Agamemnon over the ownership of a captive, Briseis. It isn't the first time that Achilles disagrees with Agamemnon, and it wouldn't be the last. Achilles felt such anger over the slight that he encouraged his mother to tell Zeus to let the Trojans win during his absence. That was the only way for Agamemnon to recognize his folly. As the Greeks began to lose, nothing seemed to be enough to convince Achilles to return to the fray. Eventually, the Trojans grew dangerously close to the Achaean fleet. Patroclus requested Achilles' armor from him so that he could impersonate the hero, hopefully scaring the enemy away from their ships. While Achilles concedes, he tells Patroclus to return as soon as the Trojans begin their retreat to the gates of Troy. Patroclus does not listen to his dear Achilles. While pursuing the Trojans, Patroclus is killed. He is struck down instead by Hector, who is aided by the god Apollo. Hector then strips Patroclus of Achilles' armor. When Achilles discovered Patroclus' death, he threw himself weeping to the ground. He tore at his hair and wailed so loudly that his mother, then among her Nereid sisters, heard his cries. The anger he had towards Agamemnon is promptly replaced with heavy grief over his friend's death. He agreed to return to the war only to avenge Patroclus. Achilles' wrath was unleashed upon the Trojans following his friend's death. He was a one-man killing machine, fighting all who stood against him. The object of Achilles' ire was none other than Hector, the Trojan prince that fell Patroclus. The hero even throws hands with a river god since he told Achilles to stop killing so many Trojans. Of course, the Scamander River won, nearly drowning Achilles, but the point is that Achilles had a bone to pick with everyone. Not even the divine was spared his wrath. During this mourning period, Achilles refuses food and drink. Sleep evades him, though in the small moments of shut-eye, he does get Patroclus haunts him. Eventually, Achilles does get the chance to meet Hector on the battlefield. Hector is aware that Achilles is hell-bent on killing him, though still attempts to reason with the Greek hero. Achilles chases Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times before Hector faces the raging man. He agreed to a duel on the chance that the victor would return the other's body to their respective side. Hardened by the death of Patroclus, Achilles looks Hector in the eyes and tells him to stop begging, that he would rip apart his flesh himself and devour him, but since he couldn't, he would throw him instead to the dogs. The 2 men duel and Hector is killed. Achilles then dragged Hector's body behind his chariot to humiliate him and the Trojans. It isn't until King Priam comes to Achilles' tent begging for the return of his son's body that Hector's corpse is returned to his family. Many spectres appear when Odysseus performs a chthonic sacrifice to summon the seer. One of these spirits was that of Achilles, Odysseus' former comrade. Alongside him were shades of Patroclus, Ajax, and Antilochus. The 2 Greek heroes converse, with Odysseus encouraging Achilles not to grieve his own death since he had more leisure in death than he did in life. Achilles, on the other hand, is not so convinced. I'd rather serve as another man's labourer, as a poor peasant without land, and be alive on earth than be lord of all the lifeless dead. They then discuss Neoptolemus, Achilles' son with Deidamia of Skyros. Odysseus reveals that Neoptolemus was as much a skilled warrior as his father. He even fought in the war that killed Achilles, likewise fighting in the Greek army. Upon hearing the news, Achilles receded to the fields of Asphodel, pleased with the success of his son. The death of Achilles took place before the end of the Trojan War. In the most common retelling of the myth, the Trojan prince Paris pierced Achilles' heel with an arrow. Apollodorus confirms this in chapter 5 of Epitome, as well as in Statius Achilleid. The arrow was only able to strike Achilles' heel because it was being guided by the Greek god Apollo. In nearly all iterations of Achilles' death, it is always Apollo that leads Paris' arrow. Throughout many myths regarding Achilles, Apollo always had a bit of a thing against him. Sure, the god was partial to the Trojans, but Achilles also committed some ire-worthy acts. He kidnapped a daughter of a priest of Apollo, which led to a plague sweeping through the Greek camp. He also may or may not have killed Apollo's speculated son, Troilus, at a temple of Apollo. Since Thetis managed to convince Zeus to bring honor to Achilles, the man died a hero's death. Achilles' armor has quite a significance in the Iliad. It was crafted by none other than the Greek god Hephaestus to be impenetrable. More than being magically enchanted, Achilles' armor was also a sight to behold. Homer describes the armor as being polished bronze and decorated with stars. The set, according to Achilles in the Iliad, was gifted to Peleus at his wedding to Thetis. After Achilles withdraws from the battle because of his dispute with Agamemnon, the armor ends up with Patroclus. Homer mentions Patroclus to have requested the armor for a single defensive mission. Other sources have suggested that Patroclus stole the armor since he knew Achilles would deny him a return to the battle. Regardless, Patroclus wears Achilles' armor into battle against Hector and his men. The armor of Achilles was taken by Hector after Patroclus' death. Next time, it appears Hector is wearing it to face off with Achilles. After Achilles loses possession of the fabled armor, Thetis petitions Hephaestus to make a new set for her son. This time around, Achilles has a spectacular shield made by the god as well. Though not a god, Achilles was worshipped within select hero cults of ancient Greece. Hero cults involved the veneration of heroes or heroines among specific locales. This interesting facet of Greek religion is oftentimes equated to ancestral worship. a hero cult was normally established at the site of a hero's life or death. As for the heroes in Homer's works, they all were likely worshipped in local hero cults throughout ancient Greece. When Achilles fell in battle, his death marked the beginning of a hero cult. A tomb was established, the tumuli of Achilles, where the bones of the hero were left with those of Patroclus. The tomb had been the location of numerous ritualistic sacrifices in the ancient past. Even Alexander the Great stopped by to pay homage to the late heroes on his travels. The heroic cult of Achilles was bordered on being pan-Hellenic. Various locations of worship were spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. Of these, Achilles had cult sanctuaries established in Sparta, Illes, and his homeland of Thessaly. Worship was also evident throughout southern Italian coastal regions. Achilles was thought to have openly taken both male and female lovers during his life. He fathered a child with Deidamia of Skyros during his formative years and allowed his affection for Briseis to tear a rift between himself and Agamemnon. In some variations of Greek mythology, Achilles even had romantic relations with both Iphigenia and Polyxena. Regardless of his confirmed and implicit trysts with women, there are at least 2 people of the male sex that the Greek hero reportedly fell in love with. It is valuable to note that homosexuality in ancient Greek society was viewed differently than it is today. Same-sex relationships, especially amongst those in military service, were not unusual. With all things considered, the elite sacred band of Thebes was established during the Peloponnesian War, thereby making such intimate relationships somewhat beneficial in that aspect. As it was, same-sex relationships were viewed differently throughout different regions of ancient Greece. Whereas some city-states encouraged these relationships, others like Athens expected men to settle down and have children. The most well-known of Achilles' list of lovers is Patroclus. After having killed another child in his youth, Patroclus was passed off to Achilles' father, who then assigned the boy to be his son's attendant. From that point on, Achilles and Patroclus were inseparable. During the war, Patroclus followed Achilles to the front lines. Despite the prince being in a position of leadership, Patroclus displayed a greater sense of awareness, self-control, and wisdom. Much of the time, Patroclus was regarded as a role model for a young Achilles despite being only a handful of years older. When Achilles left the fighting after being disrespected by Agamemnon, he brought his Myrmidons with him. This left the outcome of the war bleak for the Greek army. A desperate Patroclus returned to combat impersonating Achilles, donning his armor and commanding the Myrmidons. Amid combat, Patroclus was robbed of his wits by the Greek god Apollo. He was dazed enough to allow an opening for the Trojan prince Hector to strike a killing blow. Upon hearing of Patroclus' death, Achilles went into a period of grieving. The body of Patroclus went unburied until Patroclus manifested in Achilles' dreams asking for a proper burial. When Achilles eventually died, his ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus, the man he loved as my own life. This act would fulfill a request of Patroclus' shade. Don't place my bones apart from yours, Achilles, but together, just as we were brought up together in your home. The actual depth of Achilles and Patroclus' relationship has been placed under the microscope in recent years. Its complexity is a point of controversy amongst scholars. Truthfully, it was not until later interpretations of Achilles' story that a romantic relationship between the men was suggested. Troilus is a young Trojan prince, the son of Queen Hecuba of Troy. According to legend, Troilus was so beautiful that he may have been fathered by Apollo rather than Priam. As the standard myth goes, Achilles happened across Troilus and his sister, the Trojan princess Polyxena, outside of Troy's walls. Unluckily for Troilus, his fate was inexplicably tied to that of the city, which made him a target for enemy attacks. Even worse was that Achilles became immediately taken by Troilus' youthful beauty. Achilles pursued Troilus as the boy fled from his advances, eventually capturing and killing him at a temple to Apollo. The sacrilege became the catalyst for Apollo's desperate desire to see the Greek hero killed, since the murder on sanctuary grounds was an insult to the Olympian gods. Also, if Troilus was Apollo's kid, the god wouldn't take offense sitting down. The specifics regarding the circumstances of Troilus' death are not clearly stated in the Iliad. It is implied that he had died in combat, but the finer details are never touched on. When Priam calls Achilles an andros padaphanoio, a boy-slaying man, it can be inferred that Achilles was responsible for murdering young Troilus. Something that is an Achilles heel is a weakness, or a vulnerability, in an otherwise mighty thing. More often than not, an Achilles heel can lead to destruction. If not complete destruction, then certainly a downfall. The idiom itself comes from the myths of Achilles, where his lone weakness was his left heel. Therefore, calling something an Achilles heel is acknowledging it as a fatal weakness. Examples of an Achilles heel are varied. The phrase can be applied to anything from a serious addiction to a poor football pick. Usually, an Achilles heel is a fatal flaw. Phoebus Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, music, poetry, and the arts and sciences, is by far the noblest conception within the whole range of Greek mythology, and his worship, which not only extended to all the states of Greece, but also to Asia Minor and to every Greek colony throughout the world, stands out among the most ancient and strongly marked features of Grecian history and exerted a more decided influence over the Greek nation than that of any other deity, not excepting Zeus himself. Apollo was the son of Zeus and Leto, and was born beneath the shade of a palm tree which grew at the foot of Mount Cynthus on the barren and rocky island of Delos. The imagination from the myth that the earth smiled when the young god first beheld the light of day, and that Delos became so proud and exultant at the honor thus conferred upon her that she covered herself with golden flowers, swans surrounded the island, and the Delian nymphs celebrated his birth with songs of joy. The unhappy Leto, driven to Delos by the relentless persecutions of Hera, was not long permitted to enjoy her haven of refuge. Being still tormented by her enemy, the young mother was once more obliged to fly. She therefore re-signed the charge of her newborn babe to the goddess Themis, who carefully wrapped the helpless infant in swaddling clothes and fed him with nectar and ambrosia. But he had no sooner partaken of the heavenly food than, to the amazement of the goddess, he burst asunder the bands which confined his infant limbs, and springing to his feet, appeared before her as a full-grown youth of divine strength and beauty. He now demanded a lyre and a bow, declaring that henceforth he would announce to mankind the will of his father Zeus. "The golden lyre," said he, "shall be my friend, the bent bow my delight, and in oracles will I foretell the dark future." With these words he ascended to Olympus, where he was received with joyful acclamations into the assembly of the celestial gods, who acknowledged him as the most beautiful and glorious of all the sons of Zeus. Phoebus Apollo was the god of light in a twofold signification. First, as representing the great orb of day which illumines the world, and secondly, as the heavenly light which animates the soul of man. He inherited his function as sun god from Helios, with whom, in later times, he was so completely identified that the personality of the one became gradually merged in that of the other. We, accordingly, find Helios frequently confounded with Apollo, myths belonging to the former attributed to the latter, and with some tribes the Ionic. For instance, so complete is this identification that Apollo is called by them Helios Apollo. As the divinity whose power is developed in the broad light of day, he brings joy and delight to nature and health and prosperity to man. By the influence of his warm and gentle rays, he disperses the noxious vapors of the night, assists the grain to ripen and the flowers to bloom. But although, as god of the sun, he is a life-giving and life-preserving power, who, by his genial influence, dispels the cold of winter, he is, at the same time, the god who, by means of his fiercely darting rays, could spread disease and send sudden death to men and animals. And it is to this phase of his character that we must look for the explanation of his being considered, in conjunction with his twin sister, Artemis as moon goddess, a divinity of death. The brother and sister share this function between them, he taking man and she-woman as her aim, and those especially who died in the bloom of youth, or at an advanced age, were believed to have been killed by their gentle arrows. But Apollo did not always send an easy death. We see in the Iliad how, when angry with the Greeks, the god of the silver bow strode down from Olympus, with his quiver full of death-bringing darts, and sent a raging pestilence into their camp. For 9 days he let fly his fatal arrows, first on animals and then on men, till the air became darkened with the smoke from the funeral pyres. In his character as god of light, Phoebus Apollo is the protecting deity of shepherds, because it is he who warms the fields and meadows and gives rich pastures to the flocks, thereby gladdening the heart of the herdsman. As the temperate heat of the sun exercises so invigorating an effect on man and animals, and promotes the growth of those medicinal herbs and vegetable productions necessary for the cure of diseases, Phoebus Apollo was supposed to possess the power of restoring life and health, hence he was regarded as the god of healing. But this feature in his character we shall find more particularly developed in his son Asclepius, the veritable god of the healing art. Pursuing our analysis of the various phases in the character of Phoebus Apollo, we find that with the first beams of his genial light, all nature awakens to renewed life, and the woods re-echo with the jubilant sound of the untaught lays, warbled by thousands of feathered choristers. Hence, by a natural inference, he is the god of music. And as, according to the belief of the ancients, the inspirations of genius were inseparably connected with the glorious light of heaven, he is also the god of poetry, and acts as the special patron of the arts and sciences. Apollo is himself the heavenly musician among the Olympic gods, whose banquets are gladdened by the wondrous strains which he produces from his favourite instrument, the seven-stringed lyre. In the cultus of Apollo, music formed a distinguishing feature. All sacred dances, and even the sacrifices in his honour, were performed to the sound of musical instruments. And it is, in a great measure, owing to the influence which the music in his worship exercised on the Greek nation, that Apollo came to be regarded as the leader of the nine muses, the legitimate divinities of poetry and song. In this character he is called Musagetes, and is always represented robed in a long flowing garment. His lyre, to the tones of which he appears to be singing, is suspended by a band across the chest. His head is encircled by a wreath of laurel, and his long hair, streaming down over his shoulders, gives him a somewhat effeminate appearance. And now we must view the glorious god of light under another, and as far as regards his influence over the Greek nation, a much more important aspect. For, in historical times, all the other functions and attributes of Apollo sink into comparative insignificance before the great power which he exercised as god of prophecy. It is true that all Greek gods were endowed, to a certain extent, with the faculty of foretelling future events. But Apollo, as sun god, was the concentration of all prophetic power, as it was supposed that nothing escaped his all-seeing eye, which penetrated the most hidden recesses and laid bare the secrets which lay concealed behind the dark veil of the future. We have seen that when Apollo assumed his godlike form, he took his place among the immortals, but he had not long enjoyed the rapturous delights of Olympus, before he felt within him an ardent desire to fulfill his great mission of interpreting to mankind the will of his mighty father. He accordingly descended to earth, and travelled through many countries, seeking a fitting site upon which to establish an oracle. At length he reached the southern side of the rocky heights of Parnassus, beneath which lay the harbour of Crissa. Here, under the overhanging cliff, he found a secluded spot where, from the most ancient times, there had existed an oracle in which Gaia herself had revealed the future to man, and which, in Deucalion's time, she had resigned to Themis. It was guarded by the huge serpent Python, the scourge of the surrounding neighbourhood, and the terror alike of men and cattle. The young god, full of confidence in his unerring aim, attacked and slew the monster with his arrows, thus freeing land and people from their mighty enemy. The grateful inhabitants, anxious to do honour to their deliverer, flocked round Apollo, who proceeded to mark out a plan for a temple, and, with the assistance of numbers of eager volunteers, a suitable edifice was soon erected. It now became necessary to choose ministers who would offer up sacrifices, interpret his prophecies to the people, and take charge of the temple. Looking round, he saw in the far distance a vessel bound from Crete to the Peloponnesus, and determined to avail himself of her crew for his service. Assuming the shape of an enormous dolphin, he agitated the waters to such a degree that the ship was tossed violently to and fro, to the great alarm of the mariners. At the same time, he raised a mighty wind, which drove the ship into the harbour of Crissa, where she ran aground. The terrified sailors dared not set foot on shore, but Apollo, under the form of a vigorous youth, stepped down to the vessel, revealed himself in his true character, and informed them that it was he who had driven them to Crissa in order that they might become his priests and serve him in his temple. Arrived at the sacred fane, he instructed them how to perform the services in his honour and desired them to worship him under the name of Apollo Delphinios, because he had first appeared to them under the form of a dolphin. Thus was established the far-famed Oracle of Delphi, the only institution of the kind which was not exclusively national, for it was consulted by Lydians, Phrygians, Etruscans, Romans, and Sea, and, in fact, was held in the highest repute all over the world. In obedience to its decrees, the laws of Lycurgus were introduced, and the earliest Greek colonies founded. No cities were built without first consulting the Delphic oracle, for it was believed that Apollo took special delight in the founding of cities, the first stone of which he laid in person. Nor was any enterprise ever undertaken without inquiring at this sacred fane as to its probable success. But that which brought Apollo more closely home to the hearts of the people and raised the whole moral tone of the Greek nation, was the belief, gradually developed with the intelligence of the people, that he was the god who accepted repentance as an atonement for sin, who pardoned the contrite sinner, and who acted as the special protector of those who, like Orestes, had committed a crime, which required long years of expiation. His first love was Daphne, daughter of Peneus, the river god, who was so averse to marriage that she entreated her father to allow her to lead a life of celibacy and devote herself to the chase, which she loved to the exclusion of all other pursuits. But one day, soon after his victory over the Python, Apollo happened to see Eros bending his bow, and proud of his own superior strength and skill, he laughed at the efforts of the little archer, saying that such a weapon was more suited to the one who had just killed the terrible serpent. Eros angrily replied that his arrow should pierce the heart of the mocker himself, and flying off to the summit of Mount Parnassus, he drew from his quiver 2 darts of different workmanship, one of gold, which had the effect of inspiring love, the other of lead, which created aversion. Taking aim at Apollo, he pierced his breast with the golden shaft, whilst the leaden one he discharged into the bosom of the beautiful Daphne. The son of Leto instantly felt the most ardent affection for the nymph, who, on her part, evinced the greatest dislike towards her divine lover, and, at his approach, fled from him like a hunted deer. He called upon her in the most endearing accents to stay, but she still sped on, until at length, becoming faint with fatigue, and fearing that she was about to succumb, she called upon the gods to come to her aid. Hardly had she uttered her prayer before a heavy torpor seized her limbs, and just as Apollo threw out his arms to embrace her, she became transformed into a laurel bush. He sorrowfully crowned his head with its leaves, and declared that in memory of his love, it should henceforth remain evergreen and be held sacred to him. He next sought the love of Marpessa, the daughter of Evenus, but though her father approved his suit, the maiden preferred a youth named Idas, who contrived to carry her off in a winged chariot, which he had procured from Poseidon. Apollo pursued the fugitives, whom he quickly overtook, and forcibly seizing the bride, refused to re-sign her. Zeus then interfered, and declared that Marpessa herself must decide which of her lovers should claim her as his wife. After due reflection, she accepted Idas as her husband, judiciously concluding that although the attractions of the divine Apollo were superior to those of her lover, it would be wiser to unite herself to a mortal, who, growing old with herself, would be less likely to forsake her when advancing years should rob her of her charms. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, king of Troy, was another object of the love of Apollo. She feigned to return his affection, and promised to marry him, provided he would confer upon her the gift of prophecy. But having received the boon she desired, the treacherous maiden refused to comply with the conditions upon which it had been granted. Incensed at her breach of faith, Apollo, unable to recall the gift he had bestowed, rendered it useless by causing her predictions to fail in obtaining credence. Cassandra became famous in history for her prophetic powers, but her prophecies were never believed. For instance, she warned her brother Paris that if he brought back a wife from Greece, he would cause the destruction of his father's house and kingdom. She also warned the Trojans not to admit the wooden horse within the walls of the city, and foretold to Agamemnon all the disasters which afterwards befell him. Apollo afterwards married Coronis, a nymph of Larissa, and thought himself happy in the possession of her faithful love. But once more he was doomed to disappointment, for one day his favourite bird, the crow, flew to him with the intelligence that his wife had transferred her affections to a youth of Haemonia. Apollo, burning with rage, instantly destroyed her with one of his death-bringing darts. Too late he repented of his rashness, for she had been tenderly beloved by him, and he would fain have recalled her to life. But, although he exerted all his healing powers, his efforts were in vain. He punished the crow for its garrulity by changing the colour of its plumage from pure white to intense black, and forbade it to fly any longer among the other birds. Coronis left an infant son named Asclepius, who afterwards became god of medicine. His powers were so extraordinary that he could not only cure the sick, but could even restore the dead to life. At last, Ides complained to Zeus that the number of shades conducted to his dominions was daily decreasing, and the great ruler of Olympus, fearing that mankind, thus protected against sickness and death, would be able to defy the gods themselves, killed Asclepius with one of his thunderbolts. The loss of his highly gifted son so exasperated Apollo that, being unable to vent his anger on Zeus, he destroyed the Cyclops who had forged the fatal thunderbolts. For this offence, Apollo would have been banished by Zeus to Tartarus. But at the earnest intercession of Leto, he partially relented and contented himself with depriving him of all power and dignity and imposing on him a temporary servitude in the house of Admetus, king of Thessaly. Apollo faithfully served his royal master for 9 years in the humble capacity of a shepherd and was treated by him with every kindness and consideration. During the period of his service, the king sought the hand of Alcestis, the beautiful daughter of Peleus, son of Poseidon, but her father declared that he would only resign her to the suitor who should succeed in yoking a lion and a wild boar to his chariot. By the aid of his divine herdsman, Admetus accomplished this difficult task and gained his bride. Nor was this the only favor which the king received from the exiled god, for Apollo obtained from the fates the gift of immortality for his benefactor, on condition that when his last hour approached, some member of his own family should be willing to die in his stead. When the fatal hour arrived, and Admetus felt that he was at the point of death, he implored his aged parents to yield to him their few remaining days. But life is sweet, even to old age, and they both refused to make the sacrifice demanded of them. Alcestis, however, who had secretly devoted herself to death for her husband, was seized with a mortal sickness, which kept pace with his rapid recovery. The devoted wife breathed her last in the arms of Admetus, and he had just consigned her to the tomb when Heracles chanced to come to the palace. Admetus held the rites of hospitality so sacred that he at first kept silence with regard to his great bereavement. But as soon as his friend heard what had occurred, he bravely descended into the tomb, and when death came to claim his prey, he exerted his marvelous strength and held him in his arms until he promised to restore the beautiful and heroic queen to the bosom of her family. Whilst pursuing the peaceful life of a shepherd, Apollo formed a strong friendship with 2 youths named Hyacinthus and Cyparissus, but the great favor shown to them by the god did not suffice to shield them from misfortune. The former was one day throwing the discus with Apollo when, running too eagerly to take up the one thrown by the god, he was struck on the head with it and killed on the spot. Apollo was overcome with grief at the sad end of his young favorite, but being unable to restore him to life, he changed him into the flower called after him, the hyacinth. Cyparissus had the misfortune to kill by accident one of Apollo's favorite stags, which so preyed on his mind that he gradually pined away and died of a broken heart. He was transformed by the god into a cypress tree, which owes its name to this story. After these sad occurrences, Apollo quitted Thessaly and repaired to Phrygia, in Asia Minor, where he met Poseidon, who, like himself, was in exile and condemned to a temporary servitude on earth. The 2 gods now entered the service of Laomedon, king of Troy, Apollo undertaking to tend his flocks, and Poseidon to build the walls of the city. But Apollo also contributed his assistance in the erection of those wonderful walls, and, by the aid of his marvelous musical powers, the labors of his fellow worker, Poseidon, were rendered so light and easy that his otherwise arduous task advanced with astonishing celerity. For, as the master hand of the god of music grasped the chords of his lyre, the huge blocks of stone moved of their own accord, adjusting themselves with the utmost nicety into the places designed for them. But though Apollo was so renowned in the art of music, there were 2 individuals who had the effrontery to consider themselves equal to him in this respect, and, accordingly, each challenged him to compete with them in a musical contest. These were Marsyas and Pan. Marsyas was a satyr, who, having picked up the flute which Athene had thrown away in disgust, discovered, to his great delight and astonishment, that, in consequence of its having touched the lips of a goddess, it played of itself in the most charming manner. Marsyas, who was a great lover of music, and much beloved on this account by all the elf-like denizens of the woods and glens, was so intoxicated with joy at this discovery that he foolishly challenged Apollo to compete with him in a musical contest. The challenge being accepted, the Muses were chosen umpires, and it was decided that the unsuccessful candidate should suffer the punishment of being flayed alive. For a long time, the merits of both claimants remained so equally balanced that it was impossible to award the palm of victory to either, seeing which, Apollo, resolved to conquer, added the sweet tones of his melodious voice to the strains of his lyre, and this at once turned the scale in his favour. The unhappy Marsyas, being defeated, had to undergo the terrible penalty, and his untimely fate was universally lamented. Indeed, the satyrs and dryads, his companions, wept so incessantly at his fate that their tears, uniting together, formed a river in Phrygia, which is still known by the name of Marsyas. The result of the contest with Pan was by no means of so serious a character. the god of shepherds having affirmed that he could play more skillfully on his flute of 7 reeds, the syrinx or Pan's pipe, than Apollo on his world-renowned lyre. A contest ensued, in which Apollo was pronounced the victor by all the judges appointed to decide between the rival candidates. Midas, king of Phrygia, alone demurred at this decision, having the bad taste to prefer the uncouth tones of the Pan's pipe to the refined melodies of Apollo's lyre. Incensed at the obstinacy and stupidity of the Phrygian king, Apollo punished him by giving him the ears of an ass. Midas, horrified at being thus disfigured, determined to hide his disgrace from his subjects by means of a cap. His barber, however, could not be kept in ignorance of the fact, and was therefore bribed with rich gifts never to reveal it. Finding, however, that he could not keep the secret any longer, he dug a hole in the ground into which he whispered it. Then, closing up the aperture, he returned home, feeling greatly relieved at having thus eased his mind of its burden. But after all, this very humiliating secret was revealed to the world, for some reeds which sprung up from the spot murmured incessantly as they waved to and fro in the wind, "King Midas has the ears of an ass." In the sad and beautiful story of Niobe, daughter of Tantalus and wife of Amphion, king of Thebes, we have another instance of the severe punishments meted out by Apollo to those who in any way incurred his displeasure. Niobe was the proud mother of 7 sons and 7 daughters, and exulting in the number of her children, she, upon one occasion, ridiculed the worship of Leto because she had but 1 son and daughter, and desired the Thebans, for the future, to give to her the honours and sacrifices which they had hitherto offered to the mother of Apollo and Artemis. The sacrilegious words had scarcely passed her lips before Apollo called upon his sister Artemis to assist him in avenging the insult offered to their mother, and soon their invisible arrows sped through the air. Apollo slew all the sons, and Artemis had already slain all the daughters save one, the youngest and best beloved, whom Niobe clasped in her arms when the agonized mother implored the enraged deities to leave her, at least one out of all her beautiful children. But, even as she prayed, the deadly arrow reached the heart of this child also. Meanwhile, the unhappy father, unable to bear the loss of his children, had destroyed himself, and his dead body lay beside the lifeless corpse of his favourite son. Widowed and childless, the heartbroken mother sat among her dead, and the gods, in pity for her unutterable woe, turned her into a stone, which they transferred to Syphilis, her native Phrygian mountain, where it still continues to shed tears. The punishment of Niobe forms the subject of a magnificent marble group, which was found at Rome in the year 1553, and is now in the Gallery of Uffizi at Florence. The renowned singer Orpheus was the son of Apollo and Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and, as might be expected with parents so highly gifted, was endowed with most distinguished intellectual qualifications. He was a poet, a teacher of the religious doctrines known as the Orphic Mysteries, and a great musician, having inherited from his father an extraordinary genius for music. When he sang to the sweet tones of his lyre, he charmed all nature and summoned round him the wild beasts of the forests, who, under the influence of his music, became tame and gentle as lambs. The madly rushing torrents stopped their rapid course, and the very mountains and trees moved from their places at the sound of his entrancing melodies. Orpheus became united to a lovely nymph named Eurydice, the daughter of the sea god Nereus, whom he fondly loved. She was no less attached to him, and their married life was full of joy and happiness. But it was only short-lived, for Aristeus, the half-brother of Orpheus, having fallen in love with the beautiful Eurydice, forcibly endeavoured to take her from her husband, and as she fled across some fields to elude his pursuit, she was bitten in the foot by a venomous snake which lay concealed in the long grass. Eurydice died of the wound, and her sorrowing husband filled the groves and valleys with his piteous and unceasing lamentations. His longing to behold her once more became at last so unconquerable that he determined to brave the horrors of the lower world in order to entreat Aiades to restore to him his beloved wife. Armed only with his golden lyre, the gift of Apollo, he descended into the gloomy depths of Hades, where his heavenly music arrested for a while the torments of the unhappy sufferers. The stone of Sisyphus remained motionless. Tantalus forgot his perpetual thirst, the wheel of Ixion ceased to revolve, and even the Furies shed tears and withheld for a time their persecutions. Undismayed at the scenes of horror and suffering which met his view on every side, he pursued his way until he arrived at the palace of Aides. Presenting himself before the throne on which sat the stony-hearted king and his consort Persephone, Orpheus recounted his woes to the sound of his lyre. Moved to pity by his sweet strains, they listened to his melancholy story and consented to release Eurydice on condition that he should not look upon her until they reached the upper world. Orpheus gladly promised to comply with this injunction and, followed by Eurydice, ascended the steep and gloomy path which led to the realms of life and light. All went well until he was just about to pass the extreme limits of Hades, when, forgetting for the moment the hard condition, he turned to convince himself that his beloved wife was really behind him. The glance was fatal and destroyed all his hopes of happiness, for, as he yearningly stretched out his arms to embrace her, she was caught back and vanished from his sight forever. The grief of Orpheus at this second loss was even more intense than before, and he now avoided all human society. In vain did the nymphs, his once chosen companions, endeavour to win him back to his accustomed haunts. Their power to charm was gone, and music was now his sole consolation. He wandered forth alone, choosing the wildest and most secluded paths, and the hills and vales resounded with his pathetic melodies. At last, he happened to cross the path of some Thracian women, who were performing the wild rites of Dionysus, and in their mad fury at his refusing to join them, they furiously attacked him and tore him in pieces. In pity for his unhappy fate, the Muses collected his remains, which they buried at the foot of Mount Olympus, and the nightingale warbled a funeral dirge over his grave. His head was thrown into the river Hebrus, and as it floated down the stream, the lips still continued to murmur the beloved name of Eurydice. The chief seat of the worship of Apollo was at Delphi, and here was the most magnificent of all his temples, the foundation of which reaches far beyond all historical knowledge, and which contained immense riches, the offerings of kings and private persons who had received favourable replies from the oracle. The Greeks believed Delphi to be the central point of the earth, because two eagles sent forth by Zeus, one from the east, the other from the west, were said to have arrived there at the same moment. The Pythian Games, celebrated in honour of the victory of Apollo over the Python, took place at Delphi every 4 years. At the first celebration of these games, gods, goddesses, and heroes contended for the prizes, which were at first of gold or silver, but consisted, in later times, of simple laurel wreaths. On account of its being the place of his birth, the whole island of Delos was consecrated to Apollo, where he was worshipped with great solemnity. The greatest care was taken to preserve the sanctity of the spot, for which reason no one was suffered to be buried there. At the foot of Mount Cynthus was a splendid temple of Apollo which possessed an oracle and was enriched with magnificent offerings from all parts of Greece. Even foreign nations held this island sacred, for when the Persians passed it on their way to attack Greece, they not only sailed by, leaving it uninjured, but sent rich presents to the temple. Games, called Delia, instituted by Theseus, were celebrated at Delos every 4 years. A festival termed the Gymnopaedia was held at Sparta in honour of Apollo, in which boys sang the praises of the gods and of the 300 Lacedaemonians who fell at the Battle of Thermopylae. Wolves and hawks were sacrificed to Apollo, and the birds sacred to him were the hawk, raven, and swan. The worship of Apollo never occupied the all-important position in Rome which it held in Greece, nor was it introduced till a comparatively late period. There was no sanctuary erected to this divinity until BC 430, when the Romans, in order to avert a plague, built a temple in his honour. But we do not find the worship of Apollo becoming in any way prominent until the time of Augustus, who, having called upon this god for aid before the famous Battle of Actium, ascribed the victory which he gained to his influence, and accordingly erected a temple there, which he enriched with a portion of the spoil. Augustus afterwards built another temple in honour of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, in which at the foot of his statue were deposited 2 gilt chests containing the Sibylline oracles. These oracles were collected to replace the Sibylline books originally preserved in the Temple of Jupiter, which were destroyed when that edifice was burned. The Sibyls were maidens who had received the gift of prophecy and the privilege of living to an incredible age. One of these Sibyls, known as the Cumaean, appeared to Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, offering for sale 9 books, which she informed him had been written by herself. Not knowing who she was, Tarquin refused to buy them, upon which she burned 3 and returned with 6, demanding the same price as before. Being again driven away as an impostor, she again retired and burned 3 more, returning with the remaining 3, for which she still asked the same price as at first. Tarquin, amazed at her inconsistency, now consulted the augurs, who blamed him for not having bought the 9 books when they were first offered to him, and desired him to secure the remaining 3 at whatever price they were to be had. He, accordingly, purchased the volumes, which were found to contain predictions of great importance to the Romans. After the disposal of the books, the Sibyl vanished and was seen no more. The most beautiful and renowned of all the statues of Apollo now in existence is that known as the Apollo Belvedere, which was found in 1503 among the ruins of ancient Antium. It was purchased by Pope Julius II, who removed it to the Belvedere of the Vatican, from whence it takes its name and where it has been, for more than 300 years, the admiration of the world. When Rome was taken and plundered by the French, this celebrated statue was transported to Paris and placed in the museum there. But in 1815 it was restored to its former place in the Vatican. The attitude of the figure, which is more than 7 feet high, is inimitable in its freedom, grace, and majesty. The forehead is noble and intellectual, and the whole countenance so exquisite in its beauty that one pauses spellbound to gaze on so perfect a conception. The god has a very youthful appearance, as is usual in all his representations, and with the exception of a short mantle which falls from his shoulders, is unclothed. He stands against the trunk of a tree, up which a serpent is creeping, and his left arm is outstretched, as though about to punish. Aphrodite, the daughter of Zeus and a sea nymph called Dione, was the goddess of love and beauty. Dione, being a sea nymph, gave birth to her daughter beneath the waves. But the child of the heaven-inhabiting Zeus was forced to ascend from the ocean depths and mount to the snow-capped summits of Olympus in order to breathe that ethereal and most refined atmosphere which pertains to the celestial gods. Aphrodite was the mother of Eros Cupid, the god of love, also of Nes, the great Trojan hero and the head of that Greek colony which settled in Italy and from which arose the city of Rome. As a mother, Aphrodite claims our sympathy for the tenderness she exhibits towards her children. Homer tells us in his Iliad how, when Nes was wounded in battle, she came to his assistance, regardless of personal danger, and was herself severely wounded in attempting to save his life. Aphrodite was tenderly attached to a lovely youth called Adonis, whose exquisite beauty has become proverbial. He was a motherless babe, and Aphrodite, taking pity on him, placed him in a chest and entrusted him to the care of Persephone, who became so fond of the beautiful youth that she refused to part with him. Zeus, being appealed to by the rival foster mothers, decided that Adonis should spend 4 months of every year with Persephone, 4 with Aphrodite, whilst during the remaining 4 months he should be left to his own devices. He became, however, so attached to Aphrodite that he voluntarily devoted to her the time at his own disposal. Adonis was killed during the chase by a wild boar, to the great grief of Aphrodite, who bemoaned his loss so persistently that Idas, moved with pity, permitted him to pass 6 months of every year with her, whilst the remaining half of the year was spent by him in the lower world. In Hesiod's Theogony, she is supposed to belong to the more ancient divinities, and, whilst those of later date are represented as having descended one from another, and all more or less from Zeus, Aphrodite has a variously accounted for, yet independent origin. The most poetical version of her birth is that when Uranus was wounded by his son Cronus, his blood mingled with the foam of the sea, whereupon the bubbling waters at once assumed a rosy tint, and from their depths arose, in all the surpassing glory of her loveliness, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Shaking her long, fair tresses, the water drops rolled down into the beautiful seashell in which she stood and became transformed into pure glistening pearls. Wafted by the soft and balmy breezes, she floated onto Cythera and was thence transported to the island of Cyprus. Lightly she stepped on shore, and under the gentle pressure of her delicate foot, the dry and rigid sand became transformed into a verdant meadow, where every varied shade of colour and every sweet odour charmed the senses. The whole island of Cyprus became clothed with verdure, and greeted this fairest of all created beings with a glad smile of friendly welcome. Here she was received by the seasons, who decked her with garments of immortal fabric, encircling her fair brow with a wreath of purest gold, whilst from her ears depended costly rings, and a glittering chain embraced her swan-like throat. And now, arrayed in all the panoply of her irresistible charms, the nymphs escort her to the dazzling halls of Olympus, where she is received with ecstatic enthusiasm by the admiring gods and goddesses. The gods all vied with each other in aspiring to the honour of her hand, but Hephaestus became the envied possessor of this lovely being, who, however, proved as faithless as she was beautiful, and caused her husband much unhappiness, owing to the preference she showed at various times for some of the other gods and also for mortal men. Aphrodite possessed a magic girdle which she frequently lent to unhappy maidens suffering from the pangs of unrequited love, as it was endowed with the power of inspiring affection for the wearer, whom it invested with every attribute of grace, beauty, and fascination. The animals sacred to her were the dove, swan, swallow, and sparrow. Her favourite plants were the myrtle, apple tree, rose, and poppy. The worship of Aphrodite is supposed to have been introduced into Greece from Central Asia. There is no doubt that she was originally identical with the famous Astarte, the Ashtoreth of the Bible, against whose idolatrous worship and infamous rites the prophets of old hurled forth their sublime and powerful anathemas. The Venus of the Romans was identified with the Aphrodite of the Greeks. The worship of this divinity was only established in Rome in comparatively later times. Annual festivals, called Veneralia, were held in her honour, and the month of April, when flowers and plants spring forth afresh, was sacred to her. She was worshipped as Venus Cloacina, or the Purifier, and as Venus Myrtia, or the Myrtle Goddess, an epithet derived from the myrtle, the emblem of love. The myths and legends of ancient Greece and Rome. Apollo's was twin sister and counterpart. Artemis was to the moon what Apollo was to the sun. She held other religious facets like goddess of the hunt and the wilderness, as well as protector of youth everywhere. She was one of the maiden goddesses of Olympus along with Hestia and Athena. In mythological stories, Artemis is depicted as having a short temper and a taste for cruel vengeance. The unlucky hunter Actaeon was out gallivanting in the woods when he happened upon a stream that widened into a pool. Lo and behold, the goddess Artemis was bathing in all her naked beauty, and Actaeon was captivated. Artemis saw the spying youth, and in her wrath flung drops of stream water on Actaeon's face, turning him into a stag. Actaeon's own hunting dogs fell upon him and killed him. Like the other Olympian gods, Artemis worship took many forms. In Greek cult and myth, she is the goddess of the moon and the hunt. At the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Ephesian Artemis is depicted as a many-breasted goddess of fertility. And in later religious poems, Artemis is the goddess of three forms: Selene in the sky, representing the moon, Artemis on the earth in her huntsman persona, and Hecate in the lower world wrapped in darkness and evil magic. The animals sacred to her are the hind, dog, bear, and wild boar. Her attributes are the bow, quiver, and spear. Artemis was worshipped by the Greeks under various appellations, to each of which belonged special characteristics. Thus she is known as the Arcadian, Ephesian, and Broronian Artemis, and also as Selene Artemis, and in order fully to comprehend the worship of this divinity, we must consider her under each aspect. The Arcadian Artemis was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, and twin sister of Apollo. She was the goddess of hunting and chastity, and having obtained from her father permission to lead a life of celibacy, she ever remained a maiden divinity. Artemis is the feminine counterpart of her brother, the glorious god of light, and, like him, though she deals out destruction and sudden death to men and animals, she is also able to alleviate suffering and cure diseases. Like Apollo also, she is skilled in the use of the bow, but in a far more eminent degree, for in the character of Artemis, who devoted herself to the chase with passionate ardour, this becomes an all-distinguishing feature. Armed with her bow and quiver, and attended by her train of huntresses, who were nymphs of the woods and springs, she roamed over the mountains in pursuit of her favourite exercise, destroying in her course the wild animals of the forest. When the chase was ended, Artemis and her maidens loved to assemble in a shady grove, or on the banks of a favourite stream, where they joined in the merry song, or graceful dance, and made the hills resound with their joyous shouts. A forcible instance of the manner in which Artemis resented any intrusion on her retirement is seen in the fate which befell the famous hunter Actaeon, who, happening one day to see Artemis and her attendants bathing, imprudently ventured to approach the spot. The goddess, incensed at his audacity, sprinkled him with water and transformed him into a stag, whereupon he was torn in pieces and devoured by his own dogs. As the type of purity and chastity, Artemis was especially venerated by young maidens who, before marrying, sacrificed their hair to her. She was also the patroness of those vowed to celibacy and punished severely any infringement of their obligation. The huntress goddess is represented as being a head taller than her attendant nymphs and always appears as a youthful and slender maiden. Her features are beautiful, but wanting in gentleness of expression. Her hair is gathered negligently into a knot at the back of her well-shaped head, and her figure, though somewhat masculine, is most graceful in its attitude and proportions. The short robe she wears leaves her limbs free for the exercise of the chase, her devotion to which is indicated by the quiver which is slung over her shoulder and the bow which she bears in her hand. There are many famous statues of this divinity, but the most celebrated is that known as the Diana of Versailles, now in the Louvre, which forms a not unworthy companion to the Apollo Belvedere of the Vatican. In this statue, the goddess appears in the act of rescuing a hunted deer from its pursuers, on whom she is turning with angry mien. One hand is laid protectingly on the head of the stag, whilst with the other she draws an arrow from the quiver which hangs over her shoulder. Her attributes are the bow, quiver, and spear. The animals sacred to her are the hind, dog, bear, and wild boar. Artemis promptly resented any disregard or neglect of her worship. A remarkable instance of this is shown in the story of the Caledonian boar hunt, which is as follows. Oeneus, king of Caledon in Tolia, had incurred the displeasure of Artemis by neglecting to include her in a general sacrifice to the gods which he had offered up, out of gratitude for a bountiful harvest. The goddess, enraged at this neglect, sent a wild boar of extraordinary size and prodigious strength, which destroyed the sprouting grain, laid waste the fields, and threatened the inhabitants with famine and death. At this juncture, Meleager, the brave son of Oeneus, returned from the Argonautic expedition, and finding his country ravaged by this dreadful scourge, entreated the assistance of all the celebrated heroes of the age to join him in hunting the ferocious monster. Among the most famous of those who responded to his call were Jason, Castor and Pollux, Idas and Lynceus, Peleus, Telamon, Admetus, Perithous, and Theseus. The brothers of Althea, wife of Oeneus, joined the hunters, and Meleager also enlisted into his service the fleet-footed huntress Atalanta. The father of this maiden was Schoeneus, an Arcadian, who, disappointed at the birth of a daughter when he had particularly desired a son, had exposed her on the Parthenian hill, where he left her to perish. Here she was nursed by a she-bear, and at last found by some hunters, who reared her and gave her the name of Atalanta. As the maiden grew up, she became an ardent lover of the chase, and was alike distinguished for her beauty and courage. Though often wooed, she led a life of strict celibacy, an oracle having predicted that inevitable misfortune awaited her should she give herself in marriage to any of her numerous suitors. Many of the heroes objected to hunt in company with a maiden, but Meleager, who loved Atalanta, overcame their opposition, and the valiant band set out on their expedition. Atalanta was the first to wound the boar with her spear, but not before two of the heroes had met their death from his fierce tusks. After a long and desperate encounter, Meleager succeeded in killing the monster and presented the head and hide to Atalanta as trophies of the victory. The uncles of Meleager, however, forcibly took the hide from the maiden, claiming their right to the spoil as next of kin if Meleager resigned it. Artemis, whose anger was still unappeased, caused a violent quarrel to arise between uncles and nephew, and, in the struggle which ensued, Meleager killed his mother's brothers and then restored the hide to Atalanta. The trophies of the ever-memorable boar hunt had been carried by Atalanta into Arcadia, and, for many centuries, the identical hide and enormous tusks of the Caledonian boar hung in the temple of Athene at Tegea. The tusks were afterwards conveyed to Rome and shown there among other curiosities. E Thesian A Artemis. The Ephesian Artemis, known to us as Diana of the Ephesians, was a very ancient Asiatic divinity of Persian origin called Metra, whose worship the Greek colonists found already established when they first settled in Asia Minor, and whom they identified with their own Greek Artemis, though she really possessed but one single attribute in common with their home deity. Metra was a twofold divinity, and represented, in one phase of her character, all-pervading love. In the other, she was the light of heaven. And as Artemis, in her character as Selene, was the only Greek female divinity who represented celestial light, the Greek settlers, according to their custom of fusing foreign deities into their own, seized at once upon this point of resemblance and decided that Metra should henceforth be regarded as identical with Artemis. In her character as the love which pervades all nature and penetrates everywhere, they believed her also to be present in the mysterious realm of shades, where she exercised her benign sway, replacing to a certain extent that ancient divinity Hecate, and partly usurping also the place of Persephone as mistress of the lower world. Thus they believed that it was she who permitted the spirits of the departed to revisit the earth, in order to communicate with those they loved, and to give them timely warning of coming evil. In fact, this great, mighty, and omnipresent power of love, as embodied in the Ephesian Artemis, was believed by the great thinkers of old to be the ruling spirit of the universe, and it was to her influence that all the mysterious and beneficent workings of nature were ascribed. There was a magnificent temple erected to this divinity at Ephesus, which was ranked among the 7 wonders of the world and was unequaled in beauty and grandeur. The interior of this edifice was adorned with statues and paintings and contained 127 columns, 60 feet in height, each column having been placed there by a different king. The wealth deposited in this temple was enormous, and the goddess was here worshipped with particular awe and solemnity. In the interior of the edifice stood a statue of her, formed of ebony, with lions on her arms and turrets on her head, whilst a number of breasts indicated the fruitfulness of the earth and of nature. Ctesiphon was the principal architect of this world-renowned structure, which, however, was not entirely completed till 220 years after the foundation stone was laid. But the labour of centuries was destroyed in a single night. For a man called Herostratus, seized with the insane desire of making his name famous to all succeeding generations, set fire to it and completely destroyed it. So great was the indignation and sorrow of the Ephesians at this calamity, that they enacted a law forbidding the incendiary's name to be mentioned, thereby, however, defeating their own object. For thus the name of Herostratus has been handed down to posterity and will live as long as the memory of the famous Temple of Ephesus. Brauron, Artemis. In ancient times, the country which we now call the Crimea was known by the name of the Taurica Chersonesus. It was colonized by Greek settlers who, finding that the Scythian inhabitants had a native divinity somewhat resembling their own Artemis, identified her with the huntress goddess of the mother country. The worship of this Taurian Artemis was attended with the most barbarous practices, for, in accordance with a law which she had enacted, all strangers, whether male or female, landing or shipwrecked on her shores, were sacrificed upon her altars. It is supposed that this decree was issued by the Taurian goddess of chastity to protect the purity of her followers by keeping them apart from foreign influences. The interesting story of Iphigenia, a priestess in the temple of Artemis at Tauris, forms the subject of one of Schiller's most beautiful plays. The circumstances occurred at the commencement of the Trojan War and are as follows. The fleet, collected by the Greeks for the siege of Troy, had assembled at Aulis in Boeotia and was about to set sail when Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, had the misfortune to kill accidentally a stag which was grazing in a grove sacred to Artemis. The offended goddess sent continuous calms that delayed the departure of the fleet, and Calchas, the soothsayer who had accompanied the expedition, declared that nothing less than the sacrifice of Agamemnon's favourite daughter, Iphigenia, would appease the wrath of the goddess. At these words, the heroic heart of the brave leader sank within him, and he declared that rather than consent to so fearful an alternative, he would give up his share in the expedition and return to Argos. In this dilemma, Odysseus and other great generals called a council to discuss the matter, and, after much deliberation, it was decided that private feeling must yield to the welfare of the state. For a long time, the unhappy Agamemnon turned a deaf ear to their arguments, but at last they succeeded in persuading him that it was his duty to make the sacrifice. He, accordingly, dispatched a messenger to his wife, Clytemnestra, begging her to send Iphigenia to him, alleging as a pretext that the great hero Achilles desired to make her his wife. Rejoicing at the brilliant destiny which awaited her beautiful daughter, the fond mother at once obeyed the command and sent her to Aulis. When the maiden arrived at her destination and discovered, to her horror, the dreadful fate which awaited her, she threw herself in an agony of grief at her father's feet, and with sobs and tears entreated him to have mercy on her and to spare her young life. But alas! Her doom was sealed, and her now repentant and heartbroken father was powerless to avert it. The unfortunate victim was bound to the altar, and already the fatal knife was raised to deal the death blow, when suddenly Iphigenia disappeared from view, and in her place on the altar lay a beautiful deer ready to be sacrificed. It was Artemis herself, who, pitying the youth and beauty of her victim, caused her to be conveyed in a cloud to Taurica, where she became one of her priestesses and entrusted with the charge of her temple. A dignity, however, which necessitated the offering of those human sacrifices presented to Artemis. Many years passed away, during which time the long and wearisome siege of Troy had come to an end, and the brave Agamemnon had returned home to meet death at the hands of his wife and Aegisthus. But his daughter, Iphigenia was still an exile from her native country and continued to perform the terrible duties which her office involved. She had long given up all hopes of ever being restored to her friends, when one day two Greek strangers landed on Taurica's inhospitable shores. These were Orestes and Pylades, whose romantic attachment to each other has made their names synonymous for devoted self-sacrificing friendship. Orestes was Iphigenia's brother and Pylades her cousin, and their object in undertaking an expedition fraught with so much peril was to obtain the statue of the Taurian Artemis. Orestes, having incurred the anger of the Furies for avenging the murder of his father Agamemnon, was pursued by them wherever he went, until at last he was informed by the oracle of Delphi that, in order to pacify them, he must convey the image of the Taurian Artemis from Tauris to Attica. This he at once resolved to do, and accompanied by his faithful friend Pylades, who insisted on sharing the dangers of the undertaking, he set out for Taurica. But the unfortunate youths had hardly stepped on shore before they were seized by the natives, who, as usual, conveyed them for sacrifice to the temple of Artemis. Iphigenia, discovering that they were Greeks, though unaware of their near relationship to herself, thought the opportunity a favourable one for sending tidings of her existence to her native country, and, accordingly, requested one of the strangers to be the bearer of a letter from her to her family. A magnanimous dispute now arose between the friends, and each besought the other to accept the precious privilege of life and freedom. Pylades, at length overcome by the urgent entreaties of Orestes, agreed to be the bearer of the missive, but on looking more closely at the superscription, he observed, to his intense surprise, that it was addressed to Orestes. Hereupon an explanation followed. The brother and sister recognized each other, amid joyful tears and loving embraces, and assisted by her friends and kinsmen, Iphigenia escaped with them from a country where she had spent so many unhappy days and witnessed so many scenes of horror and anguish. The fugitives, having contrived to obtain the image of the Taurian Artemis, carried it with them to Brauron in Attica. This divinity was henceforth known as the Brauronian Artemis, and the rites which had rendered her worship so infamous in Taurica were now introduced into Greece, and human victims bled freely under the sacrificial knife, both in Athens and Sparta. The revolting practice of offering human sacrifices to her was continued until the time of Lycurgus, the great Spartan lawgiver, who put an end to it by substituting in its place one, which was hardly less barbarous, namely, the scourging of youths, who were whipped on the altars of the Brauronian Artemis in the most cruel manner. Sometimes indeed they expired under the lash, in which case their mothers, far from lamenting their fate, are said to have rejoiced, considering this an honourable death for their sons. Seleneartemis. Hitherto, we have seen Artemis only in the various phases of her terrestrial character, but just as her brother Apollo drew into himself by degrees the attributes of that more ancient divinity Helios, the sun god, so, in like manner, she came to be identified in later times with Selene, the moon goddess, in which character she is always represented as wearing on her forehead a glittering crescent, whilst a flowing veil, bespangled with stars, reaches to her feet, and a long robe completely envelops her. Diana. The Diana of the Romans was identified with the Greek Artemis, with whom she shares that peculiar tripartite character which so strongly marks the individuality of the Greek goddess. In heaven she was Luna, on earth Diana, and in the lower world Proserpine. But, unlike the Ephesian Artemis, Diana, in her character as Proserpine, carries with her into the lower world no element of love or sympathy. She is, on the contrary, characterized by practices altogether hostile to man, such as the exercise of witchcraft, evil charms, and other antagonistic influences, and is, in fact, the Greek Hecate in her later development. The statues of Diana were generally erected at a point where three roads met, for which reason she is called Trivia. A temple was dedicated to her on the Aventine Hill by Servius Tullius, who is said to have first introduced the worship of this divinity into Rome. The Nemeralia, or Grove festivals, were celebrated in her honour on the 13th of August, on the Lacus Nemerensis, or forest-buried lake, near Erisha. The priest who officiated in her temple on this spot was always a fugitive slave, who had gained his office by murdering his predecessor, and hence was constantly armed, in order that he might thus be prepared to encounter a new aspirant.